Ms. Melinda Herring, Deputy Director at Atlantic Council. I'm very happy that it's in your hands. And a favorite ambassador of mine, I must say, amongst the diplomats, you've been with me since the very first one, sir. Yeah, number one, and this is number 23. So, and then Professor Plokhii, who I don't think needs much of introduction, is going to be with us in Plokhii. They're going to be by Zoom. So, Melinda, I'm not going to take up any more space. It's all yours.
Thanks, Walter. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back here, be together. So we have a difficult task. We have, I promised Walter we would stop at 5. So we have 49 minutes to come up with a common future for Ukraine. But I have such good panelists that we can do this. So I'm going to ask Bill Taylor to kick it off first. And he's put some thoughts together on this question. And I'd like him to talk about, in particular, what victory in Ukraine looks like, what that means for Russia, what it means from a US perspective, what it means from a Ukrainian perspective, and other thoughts as well. So Bill, please take it away.
Linda, thank you very much. There it is, green. Thank you, it's great to be here. Appreciate being on your panel, and I didn't realize, Walter, that I was one of your first ones, so I'm pleased to continue that tradition. So yeah, common future. United States and Ukraine. And as Melinda says, there are several aspects, several different ways that Americans can take a look at this and Ukrainians can take a look at this common future. And I will argue that these are consistent, that these overlap and lead us in the same direction. And Melinda suggested that we start off on victory. So several of us were in Ukraine last month, had about the time when this counteroffensive was just kicking off, Linda, as you recall. And as we were talking to Ukrainians, the enthusiasm, the spirit, the morale was continuing to rise. And it's only gone up since. I mean, when we were there, it was Kharkiv, and not long after that, it was Izium, and not long after that, it was Lima, and now we're looking at Kherson, and we're looking at the possibility. It's harder down there in Kherson, of course, but we're looking at the real possibility of the Ukrainian military surrounding 20,000 Russian troops on the right bank. And those 20,000 Russian troops are facing a dilemma. On the one hand, they'd like to get back across that river and back to the left bank, or they would like to have some support from the left bank getting across into the right bank. Neither can happen because the 4 bridges are damaged, as we know, by these new weapons, the HIMARS weapons that the Ukrainians are putting such good use. That was the other thing we heard over and over about how appreciative the Ukrainians were about these weapons, about these HIMARS weapons. It allows them pinpoint targets of these bridges, just as an example. So victory. The Ukrainians we talk to, we all continue to talk to, are confident that that they will be able to push the Russians out of Ukraine. They'll be able to push the Russians out of their land. And this, of course, is existential for Ukraine. This, of course, is because the Ukrainians are fighting for their land, for their communities, for their families, for their right to exist, for their freedom, for their independence, all of the things that we all know. And as the professor said, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it's important that we, with Americans that come in and out, Professor, as you've said, I confess to doing this a couple of times. But it's important for us to remember and keep in top of our mind that this is existential for the Ukrainians. For the Americans, it's also important that Ukraine win. It's also important that Russia lose. For all those reasons that we support on existential freedom, independence, democracy for Ukraine, being able to chart their own vision. That's important to us as well, but it's also in a bigger sphere. That is for this global order. In the United States, of course, with allies, since World War II, put together an order that had principles founding this order, principles that reinforced this order, principles of sovereignty, that nations respected the sovereignty of other nations, principles about peaceful resolution of disputes, principles about territorial integrity, and the Soviet Union, as well as the Russians after them, as well as all nations in Europe, respected those principles. And that formed the basis for this international order that kept the peace, at least in Europe, by and large among large powers, the major powers. No small achievement. A lot of benefits from that peace, from that order, up until 2014, when the Russians shredded those principles. And it's important to us, important to the United States, important to the world, but we make the point that a return to this global order, some rules-based global order, is important for us and important for our security, important for global security. So again, in that sense, the Russians have to leave Ukraine. The Russians have to be pushed back out of Ukraine in order to reestablish sovereignty, territorial integrity. Those kinds of principles cannot be reestablished if the Russians are in Ukraine. So on this my first point is victory is important. Victory is, I think, our definition, U.S. definition of victory is the same as Ukrainian definition of victory, which is Russians out of Ukraine. And I'm sure we will get there. That's the first thing. Another example of how Ukrainian views and goals lead to the same place as U.S. views and goals. Another example is this question about negotiations. There are those, and everybody in this room knows who I'm talking about. There are those people and those heads of state, particularly in Europe, who argue that negotiations are important right now, including a ceasefire, so that this war doesn't get out of hand and lead to something bigger and scarier. It's pretty big and pretty scary right now for Ukrainians. But this argument goes that, you know, the Ukrainians should just sit down with the Russians and work out a ceasefire. And if it takes some, people say, hard decisions, some painful decisions is what the kind of the code is, that these people will say that Ukrainians should come up with. President Zelensky should sit down and maybe, you know, be flexible about borders. Be flexible about, you know, for the good of peace in the world now, you know, maybe you give up your claim to some parts of Ukraine, you know, Crimea or Donbass or you know, whatever. So there is that argument.
Bill, why is that argument wrong?
That argument, I'm going to tell you, Melinda, that argument is wrong, and it's wrong from the Ukrainian standpoint, and I believe it's wrong from the American standpoint. And the reason it's wrong in both views is that giving Putin a foothold in Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory, whether it's Crimea, Donbass, or the current occupied areas, you know, Kherson and Zaporizhia and Donetsk and Luhansk, which would be what a ceasefire would do. A ceasefire would freeze that, while the negotiations go forward and while we figure out just to stop the fighting. That would freeze those borders. It would give the Russians time to do what they need to do. They're battered. The Russian military, let's be clear, the Ukrainian military has been fighting for a long time as well, tired, in need of refitting, but the Ukrainian military is on a roll, and it's on a roll since we were there, and they're continuing. The Russians probably can't continue. The Russians probably can't continue. We know that they're having trouble with men, and so they're trying to get the Belarusians. The Belarusians are not buying it. They're trying to get the Syrians or the Libyans or the, Wagner is trying to get prisoners, and the Russians are having a hard time getting men. Materiel, they're having a very hard time on because our export controls are keeping them from being able to replace their precision-guided munitions, and so the Russians going down, and the Ukrainians' material is going up because we continue to provide and should be providing even more weapons and ammunition and other material. So that's going on, and morale is no question. So on men, munitions, and morale, it's just clear that the Ukrainians are moving forward on this. And so to stop now, give the Russians something on a ceasefire or negotiations on territory makes no sense. It makes no sense. So here again, Ukrainians don't want to stop, and the Americans don't want to stop. So on the negotiations, it's also a coincidence of issues. Last thing I will say, and we can talk, Melinda, more about the state-sponsored terrorism, which I know you wanted to get to. But the last one is on accountability. And Ukrainians rightly are outraged. They are horrified. They are angry at the atrocities, at the war crimes, let's be clear, genocide. I mean, we talked about what Putin says about Ukraine in this last panel. I'm sure we've been talking about it all day. It's, wiping Ukraine off, that's genocide. That's genocide. And Ukrainians want accountability for those crimes. And again, in a broader sense, the United States and the Western community wants the same kind of thing, wants accountability. It cannot go unpunished, the kinds of crimes that the Russians have perpetrated in the rest of the world, and for others to see that these kinds of crimes are gotten away with somehow, it's a horrible message. So again, U.S. and Ukraine, same thing. So I will stop there because I know you're tight on time, Melinda. So over to you and over to the next two people.
Thank you, Bill. Can I draw you out on two questions?
Yep.
So our friend Ben Hodges, who used to command the army in Europe, is very bullish right now. And you're a former military man, or always a military man. So I'm curious if you're as bullish as he is. He says that he expects the Ukrainians to have retaken all the way back to the February 23rd borders by the end of the year and be in Crimea by next year. What do you think about that?
I agree with almost all of what General Hodges says. That is, as I mentioned earlier, the Russian military is in bad shape. So around Kharkiv, around Liman, the Russian soldiers dropped weapons, got out of their tanks, were running, commandeered bicycles to go back. A route. That could happen on the west bank of Dnieper around Kherson. And if it does, then General Hodges, that I agree with General Hodges, that route that will cause the Russian military to collapse in Ukraine. They won't be able to recover. And if that happens, then as could be 3 months, could be by the new year, the Russians could be heading back for Russia. And even, so yeah, back to at least the borders, certainly of the 23rd of February and probably of 2013, with the possible exception of Crimea. Crimea is harder. So the success of the Ukrainian military, first around Kyiv, then around Kharkiv, Liman, Izum, has been on the ground, has been because soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, supported by the artillery and all of that, and some Air Force, but the soldiers have pushed the Russians out. And that could happen around Kherson. And that could lead to this route down there as well, as I suggested could happen. It's harder to take back Crimea on the ground. It's just harder. And it will happen. Sooner or later it will happen, but I'm not here predicting it's going to happen by January. I think it's going to take a long time. And it may actually be, before 24th of February, when people would talk about how does this end, or even during the time between the two, the first invasion, second invasion, when people would say, "Oh, how does this end?" Crimea was always hard, and Crimea. So some people would say, which I thought made sense, that Crimea would come back to Ukraine when Ukraine's in the EU, when Ukraine is so successful economically and politically that the Crimean people, the people living there, say, that's where we want to be. And they'll come back. Now, on the other hand, we know that the Ukrainian military is able to act and strike in Crimea. We've seen it a couple of times. So I don't discount the military attempt at that. But I would say General Hodges is basically right.
I promise I'll leave some time.
No, I'm whatever you want to do questions, but I don't want to.
No, I'm so sorry. I need to get Hanna Hopko because there are blackouts in Kyiv. She's on the screen. I promise Bill will be glad to take your questions. I promise I'll leave time for it. And I want to ask you about midterm elections, your predictions as well. But Hanna, I know you're on the screen. We are so happy to have you. Hanna Hopko was the chairwoman of the Rada's Foreign Affairs Committee. There she is. Hi, Hanna. It's great to see you. And she's been a powerhouse from Warsaw. And we are so happy to have you and glad that you can join us. Hanna, I was hoping that you could shed light on one question. Is Putin's war simply a continuation of Russia's earlier attempts to destroy the Ukrainian nation? And any other thoughts you want to riff off of? Go ahead, Hanna.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. So first, it's not Putin's war.
Hanna, we can't hear you. Hold on one sec, please.
Can you hear me now? 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me now, Melinda?
Hanna, can you try again?
I'm speaking, but actually it seems like you are not hearing me. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? This is very strange.
Just give us
Why?
1 sec, Hanna. Almost there. I don't know if you've had a chance to see Hanna during the war. She's based in Warsaw now and doing incredible work from Warsaw with a group of other female activists. Hopefully we can hear her.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you loud and clear. Go ahead, Hanna. The floor is yours. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, so thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. So I would rephrase, it's not Putin's war, it's Russian war against Ukraine. Because I think a victory of Ukraine means not only a full restoration of territorial integrity and sovereignty in the internationally recognized borders 1991. It's also important to de-imperialize our neighbor, because from the Peter the Great, who renamed Moscow, stealing the name of Rus, so then Soviet Union with genocide man-made by Stalin, through Holodomor and now current Russian Federation. So this is why I would say that this is Russian war against Ukraine. And of course, it's really important for us to get more, more support, more weapons, more ATACMS. When Ambassador Tyler mentioned situation in the battlefield, of course, Ukrainian armed forces are very brave and they are doing, making possible what seen in August impossible. I remember some articles in American press saying that Ukrainian armed forces is not capable to return control over occupied territories. So I'm really very thankful to American people, American society for the highest level of support for Ukrainian fight. But what I would like to see more from the National Security Council, more political will to help us with fighter jets like F-16, ATACMS, and anti-air defense system. Because what we see now, how authoritarian regimes, how Iran is helping Russia by providing drones to destroy critical infrastructure, and before winter to create a condition of energy collapse in Ukraine. So this is what we predicted in June during our visit, asking US to provide more NASAMS, more anti-air defense system. So I agree with Ben Hodges that Crimea is an achievable goal for next year. And the more Western support we receive, the faster we return control over Ukrainian territories. And it's not just about returning territories back. It's about saving lives, because what's happening in the occupied territories we've seen in Izium is a genocide. This is why it's really important to receive faster support. This Saturday, I'm going with my colleagues to Taiwan, and after Taiwan to South Korea. So, and it's a time also to unite democracies worldwide to help Ukraine to prevent authoritarian regimes attacking democracies. And also what you discussed about victory of Ukraine. And for me, victory is about justice. Justice, and it's about the future of kids. For example, my daughter and the daughter of my colleagues, that they will never fight with Russia, because we will see similar processes, what happened with the Soviet Union. I think the best security guarantees for Ukraine, besides NATO membership, is also to see the international tribunal happening and reparations, and also the right for self-determination of indigenous peoples. You've seen the appeal of Ukrainian president to indigenous peoples living at the territory of nations who are suffering from Russian policy. And recently, Ukrainian parliament adopted several important statements. One of them is about a non-recognition of occupation of Chechen republics, and also and also with the northern territories of Japan when they condemn the occupation of this territory. So I think victory of Ukraine opens an opportunity for our neighbors like Moldova to restore its territorial integrity, Georgia, Belarus. And I, during the Warsaw Security Forum, I had a chance to talk to representatives of Tikhanovskaya and other Belarusian opposition leaders. And this is why I think US should demonstrate even tougher position, helping the allies to bring more weapons to Ukraine to help Ukrainian armed forces. And also, let's talk about sanctions. Russian military forces are present at the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, and why Rosatom is not on the sanction list, which is really very strange. Why US government is not ready to impose sanctions on Kirill, the leader of so-called Russian Orthodox Church, Mr. Gundyaev, who is a KGB representative. And also, it's really important to see that Russia is being designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. I know all arguments what we were received in the National Security Council, State Department during our visits, but still. And you know that it's really important to recognize Russian full-scale war as a genocide. And I hope the mistakes which were made in last century when Soviet Union was diplomatically recognized by the US during the genocide. It happened in November 16, as I remember, in 1933. So when we were dying because of Holodomor genocide. So I think it's a time for US for strong and true leadership. And I don't understand the delay with ATACMS. It's something similar when German is explaining why Leopard tanks are not delivered to Ukraine. So the faster we win, the less opportunities for authoritarian regimes like North Korea, Iran, China, Russia unite their efforts to strengthen their position to attack Ukraine by providing more weapons and others. So my call is here. I believe as my nation, as Ukrainians, 95% that Ukraine is winning and Ukraine will win this war. No compromises. And actually all these talks about negotiations could be possible after Russian capitulation, not earlier, which is really important because Ukrainian president, Ukrainian people, so we suffer a lot. And after 8 years of ongoing aggression, when I used to be the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I heard many promises and many arguments that only political diplomatic way is the way to go, only peaceful settlement. And all these attempts resulted in genocide. This is why I think it's really important to talk to European partners in France, in Germany, in Italy, and we are also planning our advocacy trips there to talk to the societies. And we understand all the arguments before winter. So Russia is weaponizing winter, but by consolidation, by unity, we could talk about spring of hope, which is more important than nightmare of winter, which is Russian propaganda is trying to disseminate to create this fear. But the democracies and the leadership of US have to create the space of trust, belief in the strong side of democracies, and through victory of Ukraine, we will also prevent new wars and new attacks or new conflicts. And I'm sure that, and this is why I'm going to Taiwan, and it's really important to share our territorial defense experience and others, but the faster Ukraine defeats Russia, the better is for global democracy. And let me at the end to remind you, in 1991, the Soviet Union disintegration was a defeat of communism, but not the defeat of Russian imperialism. So now it's a time for bravery and helping Ukraine also to defeat this Russian imperialism. Because I do not trust in some Russian opposition, which are convincing the West that it's time to believe that Russia could be democratic. And they are never condemned the genocide, even recognize that genocide is happening. So we have to also to include the representatives of republics from Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Yakutia, Kalmykia to the dialogue regarding the future of Russia, and not to be shy or modest. And also, I want to see Russian opposition together with the representatives of different republics, because they are also suffering. And this dialogue should be in like inclusiveness process of this. So thanks to Ukrainian armed forces, thanks to God, thanks to our strategic partners like US, but we have to do more. When I just came from Kyiv, and during all these days, more than 200 strikes over 10 days with Iran kamikaze drones. So they are testing, and I'm really worried about the Israel position. Instead of joining us and helping Ukraine, they are allowing this, how to say, alliance, Russia-Iran alliance, so which is very dangerous also for Israel's future. So it was really very, now in Warsaw, situation is different. You are not afraid, but in Kyiv for last 2 weeks, this is why we have to do more to help Ukraine. And I'm not mentioning Belarus, because still there is a threat of attack after mobilization in Russian Federation, threat of another attack from Belarusian side. But we will win. And in 21st century, Ukraine has a special mission to defend democracy. And by restoring territorial integrity, we are restoring the global security architecture which was broken. And I'm sure that Ukrainian armed forces is a de facto European armed forces. And this is how we could strengthen EU, how we can strengthen NATO, and how we could defend democracy. So thank you for having me in this discussion.
I always appreciate 4 things about you when you speak. I appreciate your clarity, your passion, your leadership, and the sacrifice that you and your family make every single day. I'm struck by your comment about your daughter not wanting to have to do the same things that you do. And I know you give huge amounts of your time. This morning, I have a daughter who's about your age. I had to explain what Article 5 and NATO are. I don't want that for our daughters either. So I want to ask you one question, and then we're going to let you go to sleep. You talked about the $300 billion in frozen assets. These are the Russian assets. Tell us why it's right to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. They are obviously a state sponsor of terrorism, but my understanding is that if the United States does that designation, it makes this $300 billion open to legal claims from anyone, and it makes it much more difficult for Ukraine to get the money. So why is this a good idea?
So actually, I think there could be exemption, and actually Ukraine should be mentioned that we could apply. So still, it's for discussion, but you know that in the protracted war scenario, we need financial resources. Every month, the budget deficit is about 5 billion. And it's really important inside Ukraine to guarantee that all social payments are being secured. So the question where and how to take money is not about taking loans, because it means that the future generations of Ukraine will have to take it back, to give it back. So it's a huge problem. Why we now have to take loans when there is frozen Russian assets? And like Canada adopted a bill about confiscation, and also Ukrainian parliament adopted this bill. So I think it's a time to send also a clear message, besides tougher sanctions. And also, remember, we discussed about this sham referenda, that Russia should be recognized as a state sponsor of terrorists before. So the question to the West, not to be, how to say, reactive on the Russian activities. We have to lead, and not to, because it's very easy to forecast what would be the next step of Russia. It's like with the Crimea annexation, they repeat it in 2022 with the 4 oblasts, trying with the attempt to annex it. So it's very, and with all this nuclear blackmail, it's very predictable. So the question is for the Western societies and Western leadership about also, Ambassador Taylor mentioned the morale of Ukrainian nation, the fighting spirit. So I would like to see the same morale and unity and bravery of the West. We are dying. We are sacrificing the life of the best of the best. So just yesterday, 2 very young and the brightest defenders died, sacrificing their lives. So this is why I want to see in return, the bravery from the Western community to give us more. Still, why do we see the delay of ATACMS? It's clear that Russia it was predictable. So I already visited 3 times Washington DC from after the full-scale escalation with HIMARS, all this ping pong between Germany and why they are not providing Leopard tanks for us. So this, I think, and my message is, the faster Ukraine win, the better is for the world. We will forget about global food crisis, blackmail of energy, blackmail of weaponization of energy, inflation, and many other problems. So to save lives of Ukrainian defenders, we need more weapons. We need anti-air defense, we need fighter jets, F-16, and we within the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, we sent in June Ukrainian pilots and they met US Congress representatives. This was very good meetings. So actually Ukrainian defenders are capable to learn how to operate F-16, ATACMS and other weapons. So this is, I hope that designation of Russia as a state sponsor of terrorists will help us to get access for Russian state money, and this will be also a powerful signal to Russian oligarchs. So look, we can discuss about this, but what I would like to see that US together with G7 countries started preparing a strategy on Russia, which will include different scenarios. Which is Ben Hodges also, he mentioned that the West should be ready for option of Russian disintegration, not to be afraid. We don't need to see second Kyiv chicken speech or Thatcher visit to Kyiv. What happened 31 years ago. So this is why I think the West needs to demonstrate this leadership. And the leadership includes different strategy and readiness for different actions.
Hanna, thank you so much. We're going to let you go to bed. That was wonderful. We really enjoyed your remarks. Thank you for making time for us.
No, Melinda, I will stay because I want to listen to Serhii Plokhii. He's
okay.
my
Sounds
favorite.
good. Sounds good.
He's
Grab
my
a cup of coffee.
favorite historian.
Okay.
And so this I'll listen to him. And after, I'll be like sure that I can go to sleep.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Hanna. Okay, last but certainly not least, hi, Serhii. Sergei doesn't need any introduction. I would love for you to reflect on this question. Why is Russia mired in its imperial legacy? It seems like it's never going to escape. Was Richard Pipes right? Is Russia a patrimonial state?
First of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to appear on this panel. And I think that it's not too early and it's the right time to start talking about the future of Ukraine after the war. It's too early to declare victory. It's the war. Things go in different directions. And the war continues. What we know very well, and what we heard at this panel as well, is that Ukrainians are determined to fight, to defend themselves, to defend values, Europe, the world. And what is needed is the unity of the world and no delays with the delivering on the promises and supply of the weapons. Because if there would be more weapons in the spring, probably less weapons would be needed today. So this is a general statement on the war and the future. And in terms of victory, I certainly agree that victory is defined not just in geographic terms and not just in the terms of the borders. The victory is defeating Russia and making it incapable of repetition of things that are happening today. Without achieving that goal, any form of reconstruction of Ukraine, any form of the positive future for Ukraine become questionable, if not impossible. Russia is there certainly on the track of the imperial control and annexation, and from that point of view, yeah, there is a long continuity in history coming from the rise of the Russian state when the autocratic Moscow defeats democratic Novgorod. And that story continues. This war is not just the continuation of the disintegration of the Soviet Union that started in 1991. This is the war of the disintegration of the Russian Empire that began in 1917. And the sooner and more decisive the victory of Ukraine in this war, the sooner the process of that disintegration comes to an end, and not just for Ukraine, but for the post-Soviet space in general. Ukrainian referendum in 1991 really ended the history of the Soviet Union, and Ukrainian victory, when it is achieved, will certainly put an end to this post-imperial aspirations of Russia. So again, I think there is a long imperial process the long imperial story in process, and it's time for it to end. Now, it's difficult to say when exactly the war will come to an end. It's difficult to say what exactly the outcome will be, but there are certain things that are already obvious today, or were obvious even 1 week after the start of the war. First, Ukraine is there to stay. The plan was to destroy the Ukrainian state, to deny the right of Ukrainian nation to exist. That certainly was not just the statement made by Vladimir Putin in his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. That was foundation for the planning of this so-called military operation, that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same, and the nationalists who didn't believe in that should be destroyed. So Ukraine proved its right to exist, and it will continue. That question was answered within the first few days after the invasion, with a great surprise, not only to Russia, but also to many in Washington who believed that Kyiv would fall within 1 week or within 2 weeks, and the Ukrainian army probably would not be able to fight. Another thing that is obvious also today, Ukraine emerges out of this war and out of this humanitarian catastrophe as a stronger nation in one particular way. And that is much more unified nation. This is a nation that is much more invested into its state and into its armed forces, and unified also in regional terms, in terms of building cross-linguistic and cross-cultural and cross-religious unity. Ukraine is also de facto, in many ways, is already member of the Western Club of Nations. The reception that the Ukrainian refugees received in Europe is one of the examples of that. The NATO and Western military equipment and technology and arms is another result of another signal of that. The candidate member status in the European Union is one more proof of the entire situation. One thing that this war probably will produce is the end of the gray areas in Europe. And Ukraine started that war very much being part of that, or the core of that gray area. And it is very clear that by now Ukrainians really demonstrated not only to the outside world, but also to themselves where they want to go, where they belong. And that's shift toward the West is certainly not just Ukrainian story, it is a European story, and also on a certain level, a global story. These are things that, at least from my perspective, are already clear. This is certainly the realization of all of that is the matter of the future, but the direction, the trend is obvious. The victory of Ukraine also will involve rebuilding of Ukraine, or really restructuring Ukraine maybe on a different base. And that will create opportunity for Ukraine to build a much more effective and socially just economy. This is once and when the Marshall Plan comes, I hope that, like it was the case with the original Marshall Plan, it comes with strings attached, not only in terms of democracy, but also in terms of the monopolies that exist in Ukrainian economy, in terms of corruption, and so on and so forth. And that will be really the opportunity for Ukraine to rebuild itself from bottom also in economic terms, and to a degree in social terms. Ukraine is defending democracy today, on the same time making certain sacrifice in terms of the democratic functioning within the country, which is the outcome and the normal condition of every war. It will be important for Ukraine to really emerge out of that war without losing any enthusiasm for democracy or ability to be and continue a democratic state. And I'm pretty convinced that people who took arms in their hands in defense, yes, of themselves, of their families, but also of values like democratic values, that's one very clear thing that separates Ukraine from Russia, that they will not give up on the democratic practices, rights, and possibilities that democracy offers after the end of the war. And finally, my last comment is on thing that was very important for Ukraine, continues to be important today. That's the issue of regionalism. Ukrainian regionalism is a fact. It was certainly played against Ukraine quite effectively in 2014. And the war really produced a much more unified Ukraine also in regional terms than it was before. And it continues doing that with every passing day. But if Ukraine gets really to its not only 2014, but 1991 borders, the question will be also about these new regions and new regionalism and the new challenge that will present. And that will be a big challenge, again, if Ukraine stays democratic, and I just can't imagine Ukraine staying any other way. What is the way of reintegration of those territories, and what is the way of building society or rebuilding society in this new old borders, the borders of 1991. So just to sum up, I see things that are already been decided on the battlefields of this war for Ukraine, things that the war can produce not only terrible destruction, but also an opportunity of building a new country, and also challenges that will come with victory, at least the victory how we imagine it. So again, it was a pleasure to be on this panel. I know we don't have really much time for discussion, but thank you for your attention. And Hanna, thanks for staying late. I hope you were not completely disappointed.
They definitely didn't disappoint us. Thank you so much. Serhii, your point on regionalism, I think, is a really important one. And we have 5 or 6 minutes for discussion. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, Serhii. Thank you, Hanna, for your wise and interesting comments. My friend from Chicago gets the first question.
Thank you, Melinda. And I'd like to build off the sentiment that Hanna Hopko expressed in her presentation and direct my question to Ambassador Taylor. Mr. Taylor, you indicated that the US definition of victory is the same as Ukrainian, Russia out of Ukraine. Based on the opinions that I've heard from many Ukrainians that I have talked to, that definition is not enough of a price to pay by Russia. You alluded to accountability for genocide, and that particular point was just left unanswered and out in the air. My question is basically this: US leadership needs to focus on a victory that will secure a free, peaceful, rule of law world, which can be achieved if Russia is denuclearized and demilitarized. Like Germany was demilitarized, Imperial Japan was demilitarized, and we cannot have the world threatened by nuclear saber rattling. So, Mr. Ambassador, tell us, how do we convince the United States and our allies that this is the only acceptable resolution for Russian transgressions? Thank you.
I don't know.
You want a couple more grenades?
Well, we need to work on that, don't we?
We need to work on that.
Paul, you need a couple of grenades.
Okay. We'll take the next question.
This is for Ambassador Taylor also, and I have a concern that the West and the US may be wanting to pressure Ukraine to give up land for peace. And my concern is because they fear the threat of a nuclear war, as was mentioned before. My only problem is that the argument for nuclear war or nuclear escalation is kind of hypocritical, because since the 1960s, we have been on the foothold of a nuclear war with Russia anyhow. So what difference does it make between then and now? The same threat exists back then as it does now. So it's a moot point to pressure Ukraine to give up, its move to get back its land for peace, when to do so will just contribute to the Russian mentality of, hey, we made it this far, we can continue further.
So I can answer that question. And I'll do 2 points. One, the United States the US government has not pressured, and in my view, will not pressure Ukraine to give up territory, to negotiate. I think I went through some of that in response to Melinda's question earlier. So the US official position, US government's position, is in opposition to that. Now, you're right, there are those in this country, that are those overseas. We've heard it from President Macron, for example, who have this view. That's not our view. That's not the US view. On the nuclear question, yeah, we have to be alert to the threat that Mr. Putin poses. And what we have to do is deter that. And the way to deter that is to tell him, and I think we've done this, to tell him, if you use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, that we will respond. And not only will we respond, it will be catastrophic for you. And we've told him that. Jake Sullivan has said that. Jake Sullivan has talked to Russians and told them this is what will happen. He hasn't said out loud that we know what the specifics are, but it's very clear that there will be a dramatic, catastrophic response. My bet is it won't be nuclear response. If the Russians use a nuclear weapon, we won't necessarily, at least not in that first instance. But there will be, we have ways to respond to that, and it will be catastrophic for Russia. So that's the way to deter it. And the second point is, in the meantime, we should not be deterred from doing what we need to do to support the Ukrainians. Hanna mentioned F-16s, ATACMS, anti-aircraft, missile defense. Those things should be in the Ukrainian arsenal right now. And we should not be deterred from providing those.
Thanks. Next question.
Ambassador, this is addressed to Ambassador Taylor. I very much admire, I'm sure many of us admire your consistency with regard to the war. No conflict, this conflict cannot end until Ukraine has all of the territory that it had in 1991 or pre-2014. Proposition, I'm curious your reaction. I'm sure among some of your colleagues, your position is considered maximalist. It could be considered minimalist.
Well, it's already been designated minimalist in the first question. Exactly.
But proposition, Ukrainian troops reach the borders in the north and the east, such as they were before 2014, and they move further. After all, the lands just north of Kharkiv on the other side of the border have traditionally been inhabited by ethnic Ukrainians. The Kuban region, east of the Sea of Azov, inhabited by ethnic Ukrainians. Again, think forward, or let us think forward. What would happen if Ukrainian troops move into these two areas? Then one can have a discussion with Russia about diplomacy and, negotiations. Negotiations from strength, not from just the minimalist position.
When we start, the value of this rules-based international order that I talked about since 1945 is that it prevented or deterred or helped avoid major conflicts in Europe. And one of the tenets of that order was respect for borders. So when the Soviet Union disappeared, Soviet Union imploded, all 15 nations, new nations, agreed on the borders. They agreed that they would not, and there were, as you know, as people in this room know better than I, there were a lot of questionable borders. There were a lot of disputed borders. But the agreement was, we're going to live by these borders. We're not going to fight, or we're not going to try to change these borders. And that, under that rubric, is why Crimea is part of Ukraine, because that's where it was in 1991. So my own view is that's, if we start going back, if we start changing borders based on history, I've talked to Armenians. When I first went to Yerevan, the Armenians said that they knew that they were instructing me right at the outset, and they said, Mr. Ambassador, Armenia used to be this big, and now we're only this big. And I've been to Lithuania. We've all talked to Lithuanians. Lithuania used to be this big, and now it's only this big. We could go back to any particular part of the point in time and say, those were the borders. My view is stick with the borders that 1991. Maybe you call that minimalist. Okay, I accept that. If we could get there, I'd be happy.
Very
Thank you so
briefly,
much.
but very briefly, so I'm not misunderstood. And this is important. I am not suggesting that the borders should be changed. I am not suggesting that these territories need to be part of Ukraine. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is use it as a negotiating tool. That is, we can talk with Russia when you're on their territory and not when, this is all I'm saying, okay?
I hear you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. You get a 30-second stretch break, and then we have the wonderful Robin Dunnigan and Michael up next. Ambassador Taylor will be glad to take your question. I'm at time.
Very quick question.
Walter told me I have to stop.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
I've got three professors here, and that's the problem. It's Toronto.
I promise Bill will come over and answer your question.
But it's just a
Hold on,
very
hold
short,
on. Yeah, this is.
short question. What would your position or the American position be on Ukraine returning to become a nuclear power?
I'd say it's a bad idea. There's a lot that goes into being a nuclear power that Ukraine doesn't now have. So it would be a major effort, a very expensive major effort. However, it would certainly deter the Russians to use the same kind of attack.
Okay, last question. Go for it.
My question is also to Ambassador Taylor. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that cohort of people who are looking forward to flexibility, negotiation, a negotiated settlement. My question is, how do they envision for this diplomatic solution, if it were to come, to hold? After all, Ukraine had a border agreement with Russia. Ukraine had the Budapest Memorandum assurances, and Ukraine had a full-fledged treaty with Russia. Now, do these people expect Ukraine to have more assurances of this type, or are they ready to somehow not give assurances, but guarantee that the negotiated solution will hold?
This is why, no, you're exactly right, Professor. And this is exactly why the US government, and which I agree with this, thinks that's a bad idea. They think that negotiations is a bad idea at this point. Push the Russians out, and then you can negotiate. Maybe, I hear you say push the Russians even farther out, and then you could have this conversation. But the US government agrees with what you just said. That is, the Russians would come back. The Russians wouldn't adhere to this agreement. The Russians have shown that they don't adhere to Budapest Memorandum as an example. So that's exactly why the US position is negotiation is not right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We are ready for our next panel.
Thank you.
I had promised that we were going to have a fiery finish, and we did. In fact, but I didn't think that three pretty distinguished academics would be the ones throwing the bombs. But it is. That's the way the world is today. Right. So with that, I just the very final session, and I promise everybody after that we will have a wonderful reception and a lot of drinks at the American Foreign Policy Council. But the fact is that this is a very important session. This final session is important for us. I'm going to ask Michael Sawkiw, who has done his lion's share of work in Washington at UNIS. He will be running it, and he will present Robin Dunnigan, who has done an enormous amount of work for us in the last couple of years. I'm very happy that she agreed to come and give us the final word. And the final word is about our westward travel, our fight to keep Ukraine on that Euro-Atlantic trajectory. And I think everything we've talked about today has been about that. So I think that the final word, the official word, will come from Ms. Robin. Okay.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I and Robin are the last ones before you depart for an evening reception. So we'll try to make this quick, but we'll obviously try to make this of relevant substance to the conference of today. The conference of today, forging a strong yet forbearing national identity for Ukraine. What is the aspect of what we're discussing throughout the day? And I do apologize that I wasn't here for a good portion of the proceedings. Saw some online. And I'm also wondering, where do we go as a US foreign policy? Before my formal introduction of Deputy Assistant Secretary Dunnigan, I'd like to give you at least the context of us waking up on a daily basis and what is happening in Ukraine. Today, October 20th of 2022, we are 8 months minus 4 days into a nonstop war of aggression of the Kremlin. It's an imperious policy against Ukraine. It was interesting that discussion to Ambassador Taylor at the previous panel about the borders. And while we respect the borders of 1991, we also have to understand that it's the mindset of governments and their trajectory of what they represent, which brought us to war on February 24th of 2022, and obviously in February, March, and April of 2014. Looking at the statistics of this morning, what we wake up to: 3 killed today, 14 injured from kamikaze drone attacks in Ukraine. Today, the National Security Spokesman John Kirby had mentioned in an interview in his daily brief the following quote: "We assess that Iranian military personnel on the ground in Crimea assisted Russia in these operations," meaning the latest kamikaze operations, drone operations in Ukraine. Therefore, it is under these circumstances, it is in this context of the current, modern, today's Ukraine, that Ukraine is forging its national identity. But what kind of identity will this be? I give to you that this identity will be a stronger identity, a Ukrainian identity that will have greater resolve to it, and greater vigor. That vigor to uphold those democratic principles, those principles which the United States and Ukraine have formed a strategic partnership that many unfortunately do not mention in a lot of the discourse that has been happening in the past 8 months of the war. Let us define what it means to have a strategic partnership between the greatest military and economic power of the world, that being the United States, and Ukraine, which has a 1,000+ year history, a history of democratic principles in that region of the world that transcends many other nations and other countries within that region. So we look to Deputy Assistant Secretary Dunnigan. We look to the expertise of our diplomats. We look to the expertise of our government officials in providing and instilling the next generation of how do we move forward with Ukraine policy. But the Ukraine policy of today is quite clear. And the statistics on a daily basis amount to war crimes that are happening on a daily basis. And how do we as the United States government assist Ukraine in the investigations and the prosecutions of war crimes? How do we provide that crucial increased security assistance to Ukraine, notwithstanding the internal political debates here in the United States, rather rising above that fray and knowing that this is on a bipartisan effort of assistance to this strategic partner. Recognizing what was mentioned in the previous panel, recognizing Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. We understand that there are legal aspects associated with that designation, but that designation as well also goes to the true facet of what a US-Ukraine strategic partnership is all about. And lastly, I would say it's the recovery and the reconstruction process. We must think about that today so that we can have a true discourse in the future of how Ukraine is to recover. And given the Prime Minister of Ukraine at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Lugano, Switzerland, on July 3rd, had mentioned a staggering statistic for recovery in Ukraine of $750 billion. Mind-boggling if you think that our United States defense budget on a yearly basis is of that same amount. So with that, Deputy Assistant Secretary Dunnigan, I introduce you. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for Central and East European Affairs in the Bureau of European and Asian Affairs, Das Dunnigan served previously as Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission of the US Embassy in Austria from July of 2018 to July of 2021. She also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department State Bureau of Energy Resources from August of 2014 to August of 2017, which obviously is another key facet in what is happening in Ukraine right now. So with those introductory remarks, and with that introduction, I give to you Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Robin Dunnigan.
Thank you very much, Michael. First I knew I drew the short straw, being the last speaker after a long day right before a cocktail party. So I'm the only thing between you and cocktails. So I thought I would start by saying, I'm going to keep my opening remarks short so we can do more questions. But then I got to witness the round of rowdy questions that is probably going to await me. And I thought maybe I should just talk it out and play the safe role. But no, I really do welcome questions. So I want to keep my opening remarks really brief. The topic that I was given to talk about was how Ukrainians define their national identity going forward. And my immediate thought was that's easy and that's a quick answer and I don't have to talk about it for very long, especially to a group of you who follow Ukraine, because the Ukrainians have already said how they define their national identity. And it means being independent from Russia. It means moving closer to Western democracies. It means being on a path of EU accession. It's pretty damn clear how the Ukrainians define their identity. So what is our role in all of that is something else we've thought a lot about. And one of the questions was to Bill was, is US pressuring Ukraine to give up territory? And the answer is absolutely not. The United States has said from the beginning of this war that Ukraine is a sovereign country. President Biden has said winning means Russia's out of Ukraine. But we've also said is that what winning is up to the Ukrainians, and it's up to them and their democratically elected government. But I think that this war, we are thinking about it now because we're in the security phase of the war. So we think about this war often in terms of protecting sovereignty and territorial integrity and territory of Ukraine. But I think it's also essential that we think about this war as about protecting the people of Ukraine and their unique culture and identity. And I just want to say a few words about what Vladimir Putin and Russia are trying to do in that area, because President Putin really believes in a revisionist theory of Ukrainian history. He believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia, that there is no unique Ukrainian identity, and he can claim Ukrainian territory as his own. He believes he can install puppets in positions of power in Ukrainian territory, and that will work, that they will be legitimate governing bodies. He believes he can weaken Ukrainian cultural identity through force, by forcing people off their land, forcing children through filtration centers, forcing them to part from their parents, take on Russian passports. We just flatly disagree with this revisionist version of history, and we oppose the tactics. So I think last week, the UN General Assembly vote is something that really did show President Putin. I mean, it was historic. 143 countries all agreed that this is not, it's not acceptable, it's illegitimate, it's not what Russia signed up to when it became a member of the UN. And it's exactly why we are defending Ukraine, helping Ukraine defend itself. So our strategy, I wasn't going to talk a lot about this, but because some of the questions that were asked, I just want to say our strategy is we will continue to help Ukraine defend itself as long as it takes. We're doing that through security, economic, and humanitarian assistance, and I'm happy to talk about the numbers, although I'm sure most of you know them. But we're also doing it by continuing to put the pressure on Russia. We spend a lot of time in my office in the State Department working on the economic sanctions packages together with the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department to really continue to squeeze Russia in hopes that that will not only hurt their ability to fight on the battlefield, but squeeze their economy and put more pressure on their key sectors like their military sector. So another aspect of our strategy is ultimately ensuring that Russia pays for its crimes, accountability. It's something that we're spending a lot of time on, not only now helping Ukrainians collect information on the atrocities that are occurring and preparing what is going to be a long process of holding those who are responsible for crimes to be accountable. And, you know, it's the right thing to do for Ukraine, but it's also the right thing to do for us, for the United States, for our own security. And I think it's important that we continue to remind Americans of that and Europeans of that, because it's easy to forget when the numbers get big. If Putin is allowed to be successful in this endeavor, it's a message to the rest of the world. And I think it's one of the reasons the UN General Assembly vote was so clear last week. Again, I have a bunch of numbers. I'm happy to share them with you, but I wanted to end because we were talking about Ukrainian national identity. I know all of you know many Ukrainians, or you're Ukrainian American, and maybe you meet the Ukrainian groups who come through Washington all the time. We certainly do at the State Department. Journalists come through, parliamentarians come through, NGOs like Hanna Hopko comes through, doctors on the front lines come through. And what's amazing to me with each one of these groups is how their jobs have taken on a new element during this war. Journalists aren't only reporting the news and what's happening on the front line, they're documenting atrocities. You know, they are already working on Ukraine's heritage in that way going forward. Doctors who used to be delivering babies are now on the front lines, not only tending to Ukrainian soldiers, but tending to POWs and Russian soldiers, because that's who the Ukrainian people are. And people in NGOs who used to really be working on only reform efforts in Ukraine, but now, and if you talk to these folks when they come through Washington, they are the best weapons experts in Ukraine probably, and they come through with a long list. This is what we need to win. And they talk to us, they talk to the Department of Defense, they talk to the Hill. So it reminds me every time I talk to one of these groups of Ukrainians, and which is most days of the week, just what an incredibly resilient, persistent, dedicated group of people they are. And I'm confident that the path we're on is a path where Ukraine will emerge victorious. So I think I'll just close there and maybe open up our last few minutes between me and your cocktails for questions, because I'm happy to talk about our policy.
Thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Dunnigan. Thank you very much. I won't ask the first question. You've already heard my remarks. I'm sure that there are others. I can meet with Robin on a daily basis if need be. Does anybody have any questions? And if so, is there a microphone you go to? Please.
Yeah. Am I on?
Please, yes.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the notion of accountability.
I had made a note of that earlier in previous discussions in terms of the role of the diaspora and all that. Words, particularly in a diplomatic context, are very important. Referring to this war, as we're seeing in the press a lot, as war between Russia and Ukraine, Russo-Ukrainian war and such like, is wrong. It's not. It's not two parties arguing over some bone or some economic issue. It's not a border war. This is an invasion. The Russians took it on. It's a genocidal war. It's intended to eradicate the very existence of Ukraine. So words are very important. I'd like to suggest that the US, on the policy standpoint, not get into the notion of this being a proxy war with Russia. This is not an American war. This is a European war. It's basically cleaning up unfinished business from World War II. We've heard references to that. This is where the accountability comes back in. Russia has escaped accountability for the atrocities that it, as part of the Soviet Union, it committed in Ukraine and in other parts of Eastern Europe. They've never been held accountable. They think they can get away literally with murder. Yeah, so what I'd like to make sure of is that we never forget. And I think it's time to get in the dialogue over these issues in a public arena, the notion of accountability, that the US, regardless of outcome, the US is going to be holding individuals in Russia accountable for these atrocities, because with that, you're sending a message to China, North Korea, Iran, that their behavior in the international arena is not acceptable, and individuals will be held personally accountable for that. So the notion of getting that diplomatically out there as part of the discourse, I think would be a good idea. I'd like to get your view on it.
Please.
Thank you. We couldn't agree more. Holding Russia accountable, the perpetrators accountable, all the way up the chain is essential. And we are putting resources, both financial and human resources, behind that now. I also agree with you that words matter. What we call what's happening matters. We're part of the atrocities coordination group together with our European partners and allies. We're putting a lot of money into it, doing some of the hard work now that is really essential. You know, out in the, I know you know this, but I've just met with one of our officials who's doing this every day and going out to the war crime site. I mean, you need collection, you need to record people's memories, you need to record, you know, coordinates of where troops were, when, who said what. It is painstaking work. And even if Ukraine had a group of people who could do it, they can't do it everywhere where Russia's committing these atrocities. So we are working really hard with our European partners in particular and our G7 partners to get more resources behind that and to get some mobile investigative units out to the scenes of crimes and atrocities as soon as we can, because every time Ukraine, the good news is Ukraine takes back some of its territory. The bad news is they have to go through what Russia left behind, and it's not pretty.
Just a quick question. This year marks the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, of the genocide. Why hasn't the United States recognized the Holodomor as a genocide?
This is from a Canadian, that the Canada has recognized the Holodomor as genocide.
It's a good question. And I don't know the answer to it, but I know that there are others who have put together extremely compelling arguments for doing so. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you today.
I will say to that we in the Ukrainian community actually do have an action item for not just Ukrainian Americans, but anyone that is concerned about rectifying the past and historical justice, to contact the White House, to contact the State Department, urging that this administration recognize the Holodomor as genocide on the precedent of what President Biden did in April of 2001, where he recognized the 1914-1915 Armenian tragedy as a genocide. So there are perspectives here that we can bring into account for the recognition of Holodomor as genocide.
So, thank you. So I would like to refer to the US National Security Strategy recently released, where Ukraine's future is mentioned in European Union as within the interests of the US government, whereas with regard to NATO, it is mentioned that the US government keeps as a priority to keep protecting every inch of NATO territory. And so, referring to your point of recognition of Ukraine as a sovereign country, I would like to say that Ukraine has very soon after gaining independence realized that its sovereignty directly dependent on European Union and NATO membership. And so my question is, how much do you think there is already understanding in the US government that security of Europe as well as sovereignty of Ukraine are very much dependent on its keeping within the borders of those territories, every inch of which should be protected, given that today, there is only one army that protects every inch of NATO territory, and we don't need to mention which one it is. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to reiterate, and the president has said this, Secretary Blinken has said this, that we have an absolute open NATO door policy, that we believe every country, including Ukraine, that aspires to be a NATO member should be a NATO member. When I'm asked about the commitment to the to security, the one thing I point to, and again, I hate to throw out numbers, but I actually think it's important that Congress appropriated $63 billion this year for Ukraine. Since the war started, we've given almost $18 billion in security assistance, and a lot more than that, because we've also done $2 billion of foreign military financing that goes, some of which goes to our partners so that they can give more to Ukraine. $9.5 billion have gone to Ukraine in direct budget assistance. Another $2 billion in humanitarian assistance. I only bring up the numbers because it demonstrates our commitment. And it's not just the executive branch's commitment, it's Congress is committed to this, and it's extremely strong. There's extremely strong bipartisan support. So I think the fact that we are equipping Ukrainian soldiers with modern NATO interoperable equipment is an important factor. And I couldn't agree with you more that this isn't just about Ukraine's security. It's about Europe's security, and that by default is about our security.
Dunnigan, I usually, at least at this point, I don't get involved in questions, but one last question that I'd like to ask for the conference. We've done all of this, and you've just mentioned all the players, the US, and we've been talking about the last 23 years, that's what we've been doing. US strategic partnership, possible membership in EU, possible membership in NATO. We've done all of that. But I remember trying to get that question to you last year, and I didn't quite get to you about this. There are several other organizations, international organizations, that are players. There's the G20, there's the UN, there's the WTO. There are several of those organizations in the United States. In some ways, the United States has done extremely well in organizing the Euro-Atlantic world, which is what we always talk about because we want to be part of it. But outside the Euro-Atlantic world, is it possible, and I'm not, the state has done so much good work. We have our problems with the National Security Council, but State Department has done so much good work, but you've done it in the Euro-Atlantic world. What about the UN? What about WTO? What about G20? What about all the other institutions where you could put a lot of pressure on the Russians, where there are the sort of less than savory players or even unsavory players, and you can put pressure in those. Have we done enough in that section? Have we done enough there?
Thanks. It's a good question. Let me start with the UN, because I do think the UN has been a very important forum for having these discussions, particularly given where Russia sits in the UN and what it's committed to. There's been a lot of rhetoric, very fought, can never be won and should never be fought. So the UN is a really important forum. I think one of the issues that you're sort of getting to is, do we have support in these broader organizations for what we're doing? And I have to say that one area where I think we all need to do a better job, us, our European partners, the G7, is convincing the global South why this is important for them too. Russia has been extremely effective in its disinformation campaign. And in many places, its disinformation campaign about why there are some food security problems, why there are financial difficulties, why energy prices are high. Russia has successfully put the blame for that on the West. And there is one country, one leader, Vladimir Putin, who is responsible for exacerbating an already difficult food security situation, an already difficult energy situation, and an already difficult post-COVID global economy. One person, one country, and one could fix it. So we do have to do a better job at combating that and broadening the coalition of support for Ukraine besides just the G7 and Europe. You're right.
That's going to be your
Last question, please.
Yes.
Thank you. My last question is about the negotiations and accountability, because on the one level you see that why would the perpetrator be interested in negotiations, and what would be the result of those negotiations if he is going to be persecuted? So they seem to be mutually exclusive. What is negotiable? What is not?
Ultimately, what's negotiable is up to Russia and it's up to Ukraine. And I don't believe Russia is ready to negotiate right now. If they were, they wouldn't be indiscriminately bombing civilian targets, taking out energy targets so that Ukrainians can freeze through the winter. I believe at their word, and they have said they believe this will end in negotiations. They've laid out, President Zelensky has laid out some core principles, including Russia departs from Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to defend itself. There will be accountability for crimes committed. And there will be a commitment from a diverse group to Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, and Russia should contribute to that. So we can't define what a negotiated settlement looks like. The United States can't, and we've been very clear. The president has said, Secretary Blinken has said, National Security Advisor Sullivan has said, Ukraine can define what victory looks like. But I'll tell you what, President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader. And if you look at polls, public opinion polls in Ukraine, certainly public opinion has hardened on what's negotiable and what's not over the last 8 months. It certainly makes it more difficult. But ultimately, Ukraine has said, and I believe it's true, that there has to be a negotiated end to this.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dunnigan, for your perspective. Thank you to all the questions from the audience. I think that for a full day of analysis of US-Ukraine relations, of analysis of where Ukraine is in the war, how Ukraine has to win the war, I think that this is all bringing us to the perspective of what more we, as even Ukrainian Americans and the greater American society, need to do and how to convince what Dunnigan has said, what I had mentioned earlier, that Ukraine has bipartisan support not just in Congress, but throughout all of American society. We must continue continue on that road and on that trajectory because, again, Ukraine and the United States are strategic partners, and this is not given very easily by the United States. So once again, Das Dunnigan, thank you very much for your remarks. We look forward to future conferences with you. Thank you.
Das Dunnigan, we're going to, if we don't tire you out too much, if you want to, you can join us at the reception AFPC.
I'm actually going back to the office for work, so, but for Ukraine. So
That's very good. Thank you very much. And thank you very much from all of us. Thank you. So with that, I think that we have actually covered an enormous amount of territory today. As we opened it with the idea that we were going to see if we could eventually define at the present circumstances what national identity was. And I think we've done that. What our road forward will be. In fact, we've taken a bit of a criticism on the issue of whether we've been proactive enough. But I think today, I don't think there is a single panel that we listened to that wasn't worthy of being highlighted everywhere. So with that, I can say that I'm so exhausted at this point that I'm not sure how to end this, but the way to end it is to simply say, next year, we will do this again. And next year, we're not going to be exploring the past or the present, but we in fact will be exploring the future of Ukraine's national security, because next year we're going to be faced with a lot of the questions that we talked about: reconstruction, what the war has brought to us, and how we can come out of that after victory. So to next year. And with that, I invite you to our reception. Our reception will be at the American Foreign Policy Council, one of our co-sponsors. I want to thank everyone that worked, all our co-sponsors. I want to thank all the donors that we've had, not just for this conference, but over the last couple of years. None of this would have been possible without them. So let's adjourn and let's imbibe and let's relax for the next couple of hours at the American Foreign Policy Council. It's on 509 C Street, Northeast. So thank you, and to next year.
How do we get there?
If
Someone walk, is someone going to lead us? Because
we can, yeah. So those that don't, we will try to. Those that are speakers, we feel responsible for them. We will try to provide vehicles for them, transportation. For the others, it's about a mile. You can walk it, but I would advise, Ben, if you need to, take a cab. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Well, hold on, guys.